From the Gulf States Newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm community engagement producer Nellie Beckett, chopping it up this week. Another hurricane season is upon us here in the Gulf South. As a community-centered newsroom, we like to think critically about what the media gets right in telling the stories of our region, and what we can do better, including covering natural disasters like hurricanes. WNYC's On the Media recently released American Emergency, The Movement to Kill FEMA, a 4-part podcast series on the Federal Emergency Management Administration, the embattled federal agency who handles disaster response. To hear more about it, I sat down with Micah Loewinger, host at On the Media, about FEMA's response to Hurricane Katrina, his experience of reporting on the federal response to the historic tragedy, and the media's role in disaster preparation and response. Hi, Micah. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. So I wanted to start out by asking, what was the impetus behind the American Emergency podcast?
So the reason we're doing this 4-part series is because FEMA has gone through a significant amount of turmoil under the second Trump administration. The president, just 3 days into his second term, signed an executive order to take a deep look at the agency. He called for reforms and suggested that he might even try to kill FEMA, to get rid of the agency altogether. And his Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, before she was ousted, attempted to do just that. She put the agency and its workforce through the ringer. It led to significant amounts of people resigning, and it has left this vital agency in a really rough spot as we head into hurricane and wildfire season.
So I'd like to rewind 21 years. Going backwards, what surprised you in reporting on Hurricane Katrina?
So many things. You know, I'm not from Louisiana. I love New Orleans. I love visiting the city. But my memory of that storm, and I would imagine the memory of the storm for many people who didn't experience it, was a little bit fuzzy. It's been a long time. And when I looked at the storm from the perspective of FEMA and what the agency did wrong and why, I was really surprised by the larger context, which I think sometimes isn't captured in the stories we tell about Katrina. I really start the story of Katrina and FEMA in the late 90s during the Clinton administration, when FEMA had proved that it could respond to natural hazards quickly and efficiently. But when President George W. Bush came into office, and especially after 9/11, the war on terror fundamentally changed FEMA, along with much of the federal government. And there was actually a mass exodus of really competent and devoted public servants who had responded to hundreds of disasters. So when Katrina hit, the agency was not in its, finest shape. It was significantly understaffed. There were now huge layers of bureaucracy between FEMA and the White House. This new massive entity, the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA had been placed into the Department of Homeland Security, and these extra layers of bureaucracy, I think, really help explain part of the dysfunction that we saw during Hurricane Katrina.
Great. So what were some concrete examples of how that understaffing and lack of communication through layers of bureaucracy, how did that play out? What changed as a result of the FEMA response to Katrina and how the agency moved forward in disaster after that?
Well, after Hurricane Katrina, Congress held a series of hearings in which they asked FEMA officials on the ground. There was only one at the time, a guy named Marty Bamunde. He was the only FEMA official who was in Katrina. He was the only official in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, which is wild to me. And he wasn't even an emergency manager. He was an external affairs guy. Like, this is a PR person speaking with the press. But he ended up kind of rising to the occasion. He was honestly a hero for the people of New Orleans and also for FEMA. He ended up testifying in Congress against his boss, Michael Brown, who was George W. Bush's political appointee to run FEMA during that time. And so what emerged from those hearings was that warnings from Marty Bamunde and other officials about levee and flood wall breaks during the storm, warnings about the humanitarian crisis that was unfolding at the Superdome had not been quickly internalized by leaders at FEMA and officials at DHS. And Congress started to paint a picture of a slow, sluggish, inadequate response to the storm as it was unfolding. And as a result, Congress ended up passing the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, PCEMRA. And what that did essentially is it outlined protections for FEMA. It basically said the head of DHS can't meddle too much with this agency. There needs to be more independence, even if it stays in DHS where it is today. And it very clearly outlined experience requirements for the leader of FEMA. Michael Brown, the head of FEMA during Katrina, didn't have emergency management experience before he came to the agency. And so many people, I think, rightfully wondered if he was qualified enough to lead the agency and the country through such a big disaster. So now, in order to pass through Senate confirmation, the law states pretty clearly that the leader of FEMA needs to have at least 5 years of emergency management experience before running the agency.
Thanks, Micah. And, I noticed at the end of the Katrina episode of American Emergency mentions of media distrust. Looking forward, what do you think the media's role can be in natural disaster and crisis?
One of the issues with the coverage during Hurricane Katrina was especially from national media that came to New Orleans to report on it. And early on in the storm, journalists were in the French Quarter, which is a comfortable place to stay for out-of-towners. But the problem is that since the French Quarter saw significantly less damage and flooding than other parts of the city, journalists at the time were not able to quickly and adequately describe the damage, the flooding, the devastation that was being experienced across New Orleans. That's just one example of the disconnect between journalists and the people they cover and how it affected New Orleans. Another way we saw poor journalism during Hurricane Katrina were exaggerated reports about violence and looting in New Orleans. Part of the problem is that many times journalists rely on sources in law enforcement when there may be rumors or initial reports of crimes before they've been fully investigated. And so, for instance, in the Superdome, there were reports of armed gangs and shootings and mass looting, and there was a lot of context left out. There may have been looting, but it wasn't like people were stealing flat screen TVs. People were hungry. They were looting vending machines. Those early reports of violence ended up being unsubstantiated later on, but it painted a picture of anarchy to people outside of the city. And frankly, I think that can lead to a misconception about human nature during a disaster. People tend to help one another more than hurt each other. And yet when many people outside of New Orleans think about Katrina, they think about violence and anarchy and a need for an aggressive push by law enforcement that isn't always necessary.
Yeah, you mentioned where journalists stay to get a full picture of the disaster. You mentioned careful sourcing. Are there any other strategies that media can use during times of crisis or not in acute crisis to build that trust when information can be the difference between life or death?
Yeah, I mean, one problem we saw during Hurricane Katrina, and this is true of other disasters, is that oftentimes in lower income communities, marginalized communities, there's less trust when public officials call for an evacuation. And this is and I think part of that is that many communities, and I'm sure this is true in New Orleans, don't feel that they're adequately represented in their media. And I think to increase safety during big disasters like Hurricane Katrina, but just to do the job of journalism better, it's crucial that journalists do a good job of reporting on communities all around the city, so that there is a greater level of trust among journalists and people of all races and creeds, so that when it matters most, people are open to hearing life-saving information.
Absolutely. And here in the Gulf Coast, the threat of natural disaster is ambient. But natural disaster also hits other areas of the country in dramatic ways. I'm thinking of Hurricane Helene, a hurricane hitting the mountains of North Carolina. And I think of the heroic efforts by our colleagues at Blue Ridge Public Radio.
One of the things that Blue Ridge Public Radio did so well is that it was flexible and fluid. They went from being a kind of traditional public radio station that, airs This American Life and Morning Edition and, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And they went to basically broadcasting for hours a day live updates and briefings from Asheville's mayor and from other public officials who were telling people, where they could find potable water, where they could get cell service and access to the internet. Really important information. And they, thanks to some of their staff members, were able to produce this programming also in Spanish. And it's that kind of staffing, a diverse staffing among journalists who are able to reach different kinds of populations, really matters in general. Like, that's what we want from a newsroom. We want our newsrooms to reflect the communities that they report on and serve. But it's especially important when there might be a language barrier during a disaster. People don't have access to the internet, but maybe they have a hand crank radio or a battery powered radio, and that might be the only way they are able to get crucial information and reporting.
So well said. Thank you, Micah. And last but not least, we always ask our guests on the Gulf States Gumbo for a Gulf States gem, a special or favorite place, person, tradition, or other gem of the Gulf South. And in your reporting on Katrina, I know you met a lot of remarkable people. Micah, do you have a Gulf States gem?
Yeah, one of the people that I spoke to for this episode was a woman named Siobhan Allen, who grew up in New Orleans, was rescued when her home flooded, and experienced the horrors of the Superdome. She lives now in Houston, and I think her relationship to New Orleans was forever scarred by her experience during Hurricane Katrina. But I could tell from speaking to her how much the city has meant to her, has left an impression on her. She talked about her love of crawfish, her love of bounce music, and I just was so impressed by her and as she figured out how to rebuild her life after the storm. And I know that's true of so many people in New Orleans.
Indeed. It's a very special place with special people. Micah, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me.
This week's show is cooked up by the Gulf States Newsroom team. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Again, I'm your host, Nellie Beckett. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your brew.